Hi, I'm Michael Apple for BizNews.com. News coming out earlier this week that our President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced the formation of a National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council with the rather unfortunate acronym NAYCAC. It's a 9-member council who will sit for 3-year terms and advise Ramaphosa broadly on how to battle corruption in the public and private sector, among other things. To bring us into the loop on what this all means, Karam Singh is the director of Corruption Watch. Karam, thanks for your time. What do you make of this move by the president?
Thanks so much, Michael, for having me on the program. This was long expected, this announcement. It flows from the adoption by cabinet in, I think, as early as 2020, or at least in 2021, of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. It's a strategy that was negotiated over several years with social partners and is meant to kind of be the strategic framework to guide our approach to fighting corruption up until 2030. It's got different pillars. It's got different ideas around institutional framework, new institutions to fight corruption. And the NACAC was really meant to be the vehicle through which the National Anti-Corruption Strategy would be realized. It would be a driving an institution that would help drive implementation of the strategy, made up not just of people from government, but made up of other people from civil society and business. So I think what's important to note is that this isn't something that President Ramaphosa just pulled out of the air, or is something that we should be surprised with. It's not a kind of I think there's so much cynicism about the fight against corruption now that any sort of potentially positive development that comes out is seen as some kind of a chess move in a game to get the public looking elsewhere while other things are going on. I understand the skepticism and the cynicism that people feel and the fatigue that people feel, but I don't think that's what this announcement was meant to be about, and what the potential is for this advisory council.
We will dive into that cynicism in a second. I just want to first ask you about the pedigree of some of the individuals who will sit on this council. Off the top of your head, excuse me, David Lewis, Professor Faraz Kachalia, your very own Kavisha Pillay. These are names many people in the anti-corruption circles will know. What can you tell us about some of these people?
Yes, well, I mean, certainly the three people that you've mentioned all have a very strong affiliation to Corruption Watch. Feroz Kachalia, who's been designated via the announcement as the chairperson of the advisory council, sits on the board of Corruption Watch. He's has a long history in the anti-apartheid movement, and as a public figure, an academic, and a politician. David Lewis was the founder of Corruption Watch. This is the 10th year of Corruption Watch. He retired last year, but he was a part of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy Reference Group. David has, I think, unquestionable bona fides when it comes to his dedication and approach to the fight against corruption, coming originally from the trade union movement. Kavisha Pillay, I think, has a different profile. She's a younger person. I think it's important that we begin to look at the next tier of leadership in terms of the people that are in their early 30s and others now sort of taking up these types of leadership roles. And she's been a fantastic and a dedicated colleague and comrade also at Corruption Watch.
All right. Now, I'd like your thoughts on something that popped up on my Twitter feed yesterday. I thought it was an interesting comment, and I want to put it to you. It's from Eusebius McKaiser. He says, quote, "It is a gimmick to announce new advisory councils or commissions of inquiry or panels of non-experts or experts. The truth is that existing policies and institutions are legally sufficient. It is a lack of delivery that is the issue. We don't need more advisors. we need a competent state, close quote. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there are elements of that which are true, but there are other elements of it which are surprisingly, if I'm being equally critical, ill-informed. It doesn't seem as if that comment recognizes that we have a national anti-corruption strategy and that the advisory council flows from that. So there's nothing gimmicky in that regard. This is something which has been in the public domain for a while as a recommendation. Then on the other fundamental premise of that tweet, that the existing institutions are adequate, I don't think that is also a particularly well-informed opinion, and one which is supported by 4 years of testimony at the Zondo Commission, which pointed to significant institutional shortcomings in the fight against corruption, nor does it take account of something like the Glenister 2 judgment, which came out from the Constitutional Court in 2011, relating to the dissolution of the Scorpions, which said South Africa has a constitutional legal obligation to have an independent anti-corruption agency with specialized, resourced, skilled persons, based upon our obligations in terms of our own Bill of Rights and based upon our obligations in terms of being a signatory to the UN Convention Against Corruption. We've known that the DPCI is not a dedicated anti-corruption agency, that the DPCI looks at high-profile crime. We know that the SAPS has been subject to issues of capture. So we absolutely need revitalized and, dare we say, new institutions to spearhead our fight against corruption. We've had a multi-agency approach up to this point, leveraging different mandates and capacity within organizations like the SIU, the Financial Intelligence Center, the Asset Forfeiture Unit. I think what we're talking about going forward is something much more coherent, multidisciplinary for sure, but something that resides under a dedicated institution with special protections, possibly constitutional protections, when it comes to the hiring and firing of staff, so we don't get into a situation where such an agency would be easily captured.
So is this the coming to fruition of at least one of Justice Zondo's recommendations, that there be this independent anti-corruption body? Now, this is just the council, but is it a forebearer to the creation of the establishment of, don't want to call it Scorpions 2.0, but you know where I'm going with
absolutely. I mean, if you go into the text of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, that was the main purpose of the NACAC. With the NACAC was fundamentally the first thing on the NACAC's agenda, and I don't want to preempt it. Is this question of what the sufficiency of the existing institutional arrangements? So that could be change. It could involve changing the mandate to the MPA. It could, at the moment, we have the MPA, we have the police, and we have the MPA. We have the SIU. The SIU has civil law jurisdiction. It doesn't have jurisdiction to proceed on criminal matters. It has to hand those over. At the moment, our framework has the MPA as having the monopoly on being able to do prosecutions. In very special cases, you can do private prosecutions. I think what's envisioned by an anti-corruption agency is an agency that could look at the issue of corruption from the entire life cycle. So from prevention, so public education, other kinds of initiatives related to ethics and integrity, all the way through to consequence management, whether that be taking cases in front of a special tribunal for civil recoveries, or actually doing prosecutions. And that would then mean that we would have another body other than the MPA that could do prosecutions. So, sorry to bang on about this, Michael, but the other thing to note was the Kempepe Commission of Inquiry. So at the moment when the Scorpions were challenged, there was this big challenge around separation of powers to say you can't have prosecutors and investigators working on the same cases. And the Kempepe Commission said it's absolutely legitimate. It's consistent with international best practice, and it's not inconsistent with the separation of powers. So this is the notion of a prosecution-led investigation. So that you don't have that handoff, that uneasy handoff at the end of an investigation where the prosecution services can still say, well, we don't really feel that we have a case that we can prosecute based upon your investigation. That is a inefficient system, and a system where we lose resources and where people slip through the nets.
So, based on the presidency's statement about the establishment of NACAC, this council is also going to advise the president on how to implement the recommendations of the Zondo inquiry. There may be a lot of people out there saying, but this is just another way in which the president is consulting to death. And he's roping in other people to make decisions for him, because ultimately the axe won't fall on him then. He will say, I have this advisory council who said I should do this. How do you see it?
I see the process. So what's been said to us in terms of the processing of the Zondo recommendations? What the president said consistently was that he would need 90 days from the receipt of the final Zondo report to give a comprehensive response to the commission. Now, what I understand that's taking place behind the scenes at the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, which resides in the presidency, is a deep dive into the findings and recommendations of the Zondo Commission, to categorize all of those findings and recommendations into the appropriate categories. So, Zondo gives us a whole range of different types of recommendations. He gives us recommendations about further investigations that should lead to prosecutions. He gives us recommendations about reform of the political system. He talks about the direct election of the presidency. So there are going to be different mandate holders within the state that are going to have to take responsibility for taking these recommendations forward. Not everything is going to go to the MPA. Not everything is going to go to the SIU. Some things are going to reside squarely with the president, and those recommendations, he's not going to be able to consult to death on those. He's going to have to make a decision. But Michael, this points to a fundamental limitation in this kind of notion of what a judicial commission of inquiry can do. We have to applaud the fact that the country went through this process. I know people were tired of it, but if we hadn't had the commission, we wouldn't know half of what we know about what happened under state capture. But the driving of enforcement now, the sizing up of accountability is not the role of the commission. The commission's over. It now resides with other mandate holders, and some of that resides with the president. Some of that stuff doesn't reside with the president. We still have an independent police force, and we have an independent prosecution services. So, there's lots of things that Zondo's saying that goes to them. So let's be careful about not conflating a lot of things. I think the president, if I'm critical and honest, is in a tight place, and that there is a window of opportunity that he's had since he came in to be a corruption champion. And I think as time goes on and there are less tangible results directly flowing from his actions, that window becomes tighter, becomes it closes. And the president also now has his own corruption challenges in terms of the public protector's investigation, what's going to happen at Parliament, and then what will happen within his own party. So it is a critical moment. No one's looking to let the president off the hook, but when we're critical, we need to be mindful of the entire context.
The presidency says that this council will seek to improve investor confidence, how the world sees South Africa, and secure higher levels of public trust in South Africa. And as I think is plain to everybody in this country, there is corruption and anti-corruption fatigue, because just not enough is done. Levels of public trust in the government, in the president, in the NPA, in the Hawks is at a very low point. Do you think that the announcement of something like this will have an effect on something like the placement of South Africa on the Financial Action Task Force the
Mm.
grey list. Do you think that that has some impact on trying to show the world and this FATF that we are trying to battle corruption?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I think it needs to be seen as a progressive development. It, the proof will be in the pudding. The mere announcement of the council isn't in and of itself a testament to the fact that we've turned a corner, but it is the step. It is a step in the right direction. I mean, you mentioned the FATF issue and the potential that South Africa could be grey listed. That's a whole nother ball game, which is distinct from. So, their overlap between some of the things that Zondo's recommending, some of the things that we're required to do in terms of FATF, and some of the things where we should be doing in terms of the national anti-corruption strategy. So, for example, the notion of a central register related to beneficial ownership transparency, so that you would have a central register that could be monitored to pierce the corporate veil, so to fight kind of fronting and other kinds of procurement fraud that we see. At the moment, we don't have that kind of transparency in the system, and these are recommendations which have been kicking around for a long time. So the FATF issue is quite serious. Some of the critics that I've spoken to think that grey listing is inevitable, and then the question is sort of, does that then become an impetus for enacting reforms? We've seen some jurisdictions where countries get put on the gray list and they remain on a gray list for a while, and that it's been described to me as akin to like a Moody's type of downgrade. It has that kind of significance within the investor community. It makes it difficult. There's much higher levels of scrutiny. But if you look at a jurisdiction like Mauritius, apparently within 18 months of being put on the gray list, Mauritius were able to get themselves off the gray list. So, those are the types of places we need to be perhaps having a closer look at to say, wow, if Mauritius can do it in such a short period of time, then maybe we can do it. Obviously, it's a better situation if these reforms happen and allow us to avoid gray listing. But, Michael, sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better.
Grey listing, if you can just, for somebody who has absolutely no idea what that is and what the consequence, I mean, you've said it's basically like a downgrade for a country, but just in layman's terms, explain what grey listing is and how we find ourselves
so
here.
it's a little bit complicated, and I can just do it at a high level, but there's something called the Financial Action Task Force, which is, it's effectively soft law. It's not sort of, their recommendations are not binding, but they have taken up this kind of role of doing critical analyses of different jurisdictions to say how sound is your system, is your financial system, from the potential for corruption, fraud, money laundering, the types of things that we've seen in South Africa under state capture, and even in terms of what we saw under the PPE type of corruption. So, relates to issues of, is there sufficient transparency in the system? Is there sufficient support for enforcement? And is there consequence management when people do the wrong thing? So there's some interesting stuff in the Zondo Commission, for instance, about the role of the Financial Intelligence Center and their relationship with banks, and it says one of two things is either going wrong. One, either the FIC is being, information is being brought to their attention of irregular transactions, and they bring it to the bank's attention, and then the banks don't do anything, or there's something, it's not functioning well at the FIC. Investigate further. Zondo could only take some of those things so far. I almost think that we need to have a dedicated set of inquiries just on the financial system, just on and bring leaders from the banking sector to say, are you doing enough? And what more can you do? And I think that could also be an impetus to seeing some progress, because the frustration that we feel is this frustration that it's all government's fault. That we can't rely on
Yeah.
politicians. Politicians' political will blows with the wind, and they'll do what they need to do to sort themselves out. But there are others, within the value chain, whether it be in civil society and the private sector, that have an interest in these issues. And I think, broadly, the private sector and the business community has to take very seriously this notion of gray listing, because the effect then of being put on the gray list, what happens is these recommendations come to say, South Africa, you should do a bunch of things, and then South Africa does it or doesn't do it, and then they either sort of they either pass or they get put on a gray list. When they get put on a gray list, it means that everything is under higher scrutiny, and the flow of funds into the country become subject to greater, are deemed to be more risky than, say, other jurisdictions which are not gray listed.
You're absolutely right. State capture was not possible without the financial system. You can't get money out of the country without the banks. And so much scrutiny has fallen upon politicians and those in those circles, and very little attention has been paid to the financial institutions. I want to end off with just a question around Ramaphosa's fight against corruption. You said he has a shrinking window in terms of being what he testified to be when he came into office, this anti-corruption champion, that window is shrinking. And you have people who have been named in the Zondo report. I'm talking about Gwede Mantashe, David Mahlobo, Zizi Kodwa, who sit in his cabinet. And Zondo's commission said they need to be investigated for multiple charges, but it comes down to corruption. Does it hurt Ramaphosa to go on this anti-corruption drive, announce this establishment of this council, which I see will also coordinate with ministers in an executive oversight role when they themselves are implicated? Does it hurt him?
No, it does, Michael. It does, and this kind of uneasy relationship between the party and the state, where all this attention gets put into the sort of processes within the party and the step-aside resolution, and then the sort of non-consistent application of the step-aside resolution, is absolutely damaging. We saw in the Digital Vibes scandal, through a relatively, quick process of revelations, a situation where the then Minister of Health stepped aside. I think people saw that as positive, saw that as a form of accountability, a kind of consequence management, in a context where it's not easy to prosecute people, where it's not easy to recover money, where it's not necessarily easy or automatic to blacklist a company. You would think that the one thing that the president could do is to take control over his cabinet and say, anybody who's got this kind of shadow over them, who's implicated in this report, needs to step aside. There's no divine right that Gwede Mantashe has from being the Secretary General of the ANC to being a cabinet minister. There's just too much for him to answer to in terms of what came out in the Zondo report for somebody like him to retain his position. It's unacceptable.
So remains an optimist, Karam Singh, on this particular issue, but a number of questions remain around Ramaphosa's cabinet. I think it's a good place to end it. Thank you so much for your time.